Thank you, Senator. Senator Siewert.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the shark questions. Why didn't you require the WA state government to report more regularly on the number of sharks that have been taken, and have you had any update since last Tuesday, given that the number seems to have significantly increased over the last week?
Senator, we talk regularly with the Western Australian authorities. We don't require them to update us on a daily basis, but we do talk to them, so we have a good understanding on certainly a weekly basis of approximately the sorts of numbers they're catching.
So how many approximately have been caught to date?
There's been a number, probably 5 or 6 that have been caught since last Tuesday.
How many?
So 5 or 6.
Have they reported that?
Not publicly, I mean, but we talk periodically. We talk today, for example, about how they went on the weekend. So it's not like we don't have a regular conversation with Western Australia about where they're up to.
Wouldn't you think that that information should be reporting publicly?
So, Senator, the officers...
Sorry, that's an opinion. Sorry.
Answer the question. Thank you.
Are you aware of what happened over the weekend in the southwest?
I'm aware of the reports that have been provided, yes.
Have you seen the video? Have you seen the YouTube video?
I've seen the YouTube video,
Does that
yes.
not... at what point would the department say that that contravenes the conditions that you put down for the exemption?
So, Senator...
What triggers that?
As we've indicated, the authorisation that's been given to the Western Australian Government is an exemption from the EPBC Act, and so that means that the activities are exempt from consideration under the EPBC Act until the 30th of April. As you're aware, there are a number of species that are listed under the EPBC Act for which we have direct responsibility, and those are the ones that we're interested in receiving data on.
Dr Drips, I've got the exemption conditions in front of me, or the exemption, and on that it said that if the terms set out in paragraph 17 in my accompanying letter to Premier Barnett will give cause for review and possible revocation, of the exemption. So does that mean that you never intended to monitor the conditions that were put down on that exemption?
Senator, I don't think that's a reasonable interpretation of what the department has been doing or intended to do when the minister granted this exemption.
Sorry, what do I take then, Dr Drips, from the comments that you just made about it not being an assessment process? How then did you... How should I and the public interpret what these conditions are, and the fact that clause 23 says that there will, if they don't stick to what they were committed to do on para 17, which was about minimising the impact on of shark strikes and on smaller shark bycatch? How's the community supposed to interpret that? To me, that means you will keep an eye on what's going on, and then at least review or revoke the exemption if they breach those conditions.
Senator, I would point out that in section 17 of the statement of reasons that you're referring to, it does talk about a number of different requirements, including the use of a large hook on baited lines, reducing the chance of small shark bycatch. The size of the hooks and the proposed bait should be used to reduce the targeting of baits of other marine predators, such as sea lions, etc.
That's what my question is about. No. Have you actually seen, you've said you've seen the video clips from the weekend. There is others that show how the hooks are damaging the smaller sharks. It is highly likely that even those that have been let go and not died on the hooks aren't surviving. We don't know because it's not being monitored. So how are you implementing clause 23 of the exemption?
So,
Senator, the exemption relates to EPBC listed species. As I understand it, and I have been here for most of the day, so I haven't had the opportunity of viewing the YouTube footage. As I understand it, the species that have been adversely impacted by this activity are not EPBC listed species.
Sorry, but that's not what this says.
Senator, I'm just trying to have a look at clause 17, and I haven't seen the YouTube video that you're referring to. Are you contending that one of the particular points in clause 17 has been breached?
The fact that the impact on the bycatch is not being minimised. It was reported over the weekend, and because the government isn't publicly reporting, I have to go with what is being reported, and that is that there's 90-odd sharks that have now been taken. The vast majority of those are undersized sharks. What constitutes minimising bycatch of small sharks?
Senator, the question here would be that the exemption was predicated on the use of a certain size hook. All of our information to date indicates that they're using that hook that was noted in providing the exemption.
The overarching provision says committed to continuing other shark mitigation methods and minimising the environmental impact from the drums. Now, my question then going to the hooks is, why aren't circle hooks being used? Why didn't you require circle hooks to be used like they do in Brazil, for example, where they use drum lines to catch and truly able to release, rather than sharks being so damaged by the hooks that they can't survive?
So, Senator, you might need to ask that question to the Western Australian Government, because their proposition was that they use these large-sized hooks because of the belief that they would minimise the impact on bycatch.
Did you not check? I mean, you gave this exemption. Did you not check or do that and say, no, well, instead of doing that, why don't you use one that actually doesn't damage the shark?
I mean, Senator, the exemption is on the basis of what's put in front of us and whether or not what's put in front of us meets the national interest test. The view was taken that it did meet the national interest test, and therefore the exemption was given.
How does meeting the national interest test, how do you assess that against you've put in place the provision that small sharks aren't to be, the bycatch is to be minimised. Why did you not, what's the national interest got to do with the fact that you could actually put a condition on that meant small sharks wouldn't be damaged?
You don't have a condition, you don't put conditions on exemptions.
But you have here. You've put condition on the exemption.
No.
So, Senator, this is not a usual application or environmental impact assessment process. This is an exemption from the EPBC Act with some indications of conditions which are essentially voluntary conditions that are applied on the Western Australian Government for the undertaking of this activity.
Why did you include clause 23?
Please finish.
Sorry.
So the test in considering whether or not to give the exemption is whether the activity as claimed and indicated to be undertaken by the Western Australian Government is in the national interest, and the conditions that were reflected back to the Western Australian Governments were the undertakings that they had indicated they intended to make in this activity.
Okay.
So, in other words, it comes down without any regard to environmental impact at all.
That is how an exemption from the EPBC Act works.
So why did you include clause 23 in there around the review would be cause for review and possible revocation? Why did you include that clause if it actually means nothing?
I think we might have to take that as a statement. It is the fourth or fifth time that you've asked the same question.
But that's because you haven't answered.
But Senator, I don't think it means nothing. From what I can take from what Dr. Dripps' explanation there, the West Australian Government gave certain undertakings as part of the exemption process. Those undertakings are reflected in the Statement of Reasons and the letter from the Minister to the Premier. If the West Australian Government is in breach of those undertakings, well then clause 23 may come into play.
Okay, so how does that...
Now, I asked you before if there was a specific breach of those undertakings, and I'm yet to hear something that goes particularly to the particular dot points.
Minister, I did actually answer your question. The point is that over 90 sharks have been taken, most of which are the undersized sharks. And my question is, what is minimising the environmental impact on the undersized sharks when clearly there's a large number of undersized sharks that are being taken?
And the undertakings went very much to the process of what was going to be undertaken by the West Australian Government. There's nothing in that statement that suggests they're not meeting that process. It's important, though, and often forgotten in this, that this is a very limited time period exemption that applies until the 30th of April. and that anything that has to happen in the future will be subject to new consideration, and obviously any impacts of the current activities would be part of that new consideration.
In a little over 4 weeks, I think it's 5 weeks, over 90 sharks have actually been caught. So if we go to the 30th of April, that's a lot of sharks potentially that will be caught. So my question again is, what triggers the review if in 5 weeks 90 sharks, upwards of 90 sharks have been taken?
Well,
Senator, I've asked Mr. Geddes to come to the table. He's in charge of our compliance and enforcement area, and he can certainly talk to what would trigger Section 23 being invoked. But that being said, the short answer would be that as long as the Western Australian government is implementing the action for which they were presented or provided an exemption under the Act, then they're acting consistent with that exemption. There would be no requirement for any sort of compliance review of the exemption. Mr. Geddes.
Shane Gaddis, Assistant Secretary of Compliance and Enforcement Branch. What Mr. Knudsen said was correct, and what Dr. Dripps also said was correct. So the exemption in these circumstances is for the EPBC Act or protected matters under the EPBC Act. So the particular exemption, as I understand it, is around great white sharks and other listed matters that might be impacted by those hooks. The fact that it's had an impact on other non-listed species wouldn't lead us to revoke that exemption. If the hooks were leading to a lot of smaller great whites being caught, then that may lead to a review of the exemption because it's a listed matter under the Act.
What happens if...
Order. Look, being nearly 6 o'clock, we will continue on afterwards.
It's 2 minutes to 6.
Yes, Senator Birmingham, do you have something to table to the committee?
Yes, or Dr. Brewer does.
Yeah, thank you.
How long will it take you to do it?
Just immediately. It's just tabling the headcount numbers that were asked for earlier on by Senator Urquhart.
Okay, well, very good. Continue last question before dinner, Senator Siewert.
So do I take from that that if a listed species was caught, that would invoke a review?
No. So the process would be if they were not adhering to the conditions of their, or not the conditions, or the things laid out in the decision, the exemption would be revoked. The process, or would be reviewed and potentially revoked. The process that happens then is it's subject to the normal provisions of the EPBC Act, which means that it would only be subject to the EPBC Act if the matter was, or the action was going to have a significant impact, or likely to have a significant impact on a matter protected under the Act, which goes back to white sharks, sea lions, turtles, those sorts of things.
Okay.